morning, and thank you so much for joining us today for our Coresight Conversations, where we have President and CEO of IRI, AndrewAppel, as our special guest. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our CEO and founder of Coresight Research, Deborah Weinswig.
Thanks, Anna. Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful long weekend. Welcome to the future of retail.
For those of you who don't know AndrewAppel, it is a true honor to be joined by him today. He is IRI's president and CEO, and he has been with the company since June of 2012. Andrew and I have had many deep conversations on the future of retail and CPG, and e-commerce is obviously playing a significant role in that right now. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I want to welcome Andrew, and we'll kick it off with our first question. So, Andrew, how do you see impulse purchases changing in the future?
Well, so far, impulse has probably been one of the categories that's been most impacted by the COVID virus because there's been a lot less foot traffic, and people go into stores, their destination, their pantry stocking. There's migration away from small format stores. And just the nature of how impulse categories are bought, it's been a tough time. Now, how that plays out, the opposing forces historically in recessions, we've seen kind of those luxury impulse purchases actually go up, because that's, instead of people going out, that's kind of their treat for themselves. But so far, we've seen a shift away from both the channels and the participants that are the source of a lot of those impulse purchases, at least for snacks and sweets.
From the data, are you seeing consumers shopping from fewer retailers with bigger baskets, or a broader array? What are some of the changes you're seeing in terms of the channels that people are shopping through?
Early on, we have, and I have a little spreadsheet that I can look at, but for the most part, we've seen a migration to large format, big basket trips. Up until the last couple of weeks, or up until even last week, consumers effectively wanted to go to do one trip a week. And so what we saw is the basket sizes are up, the larger format stores were doing better when we look at our data by format, for example.
So how does that inform you about what you think will happen with some of these mom and pops? Do they end up being acquired by the larger grocers? What do you think the future is for them?
Well, it's interesting that the small grocers are doing just as well as the large ones. So, and the, mom and pop full service small local grocer, I think, has been doing, okay, as the best we can tell. I mean, we have one of our colleagues whose, family owns a grocery store, and one in the western suburbs of Chicago, their data is tracking just like all the other grocery players. So I think where it is the primary shopping destination for the family, we're continuing to see that, growth rate, very high. And now it could shift, right, as the environment shifts. But for now, up until the last 12 weeks, we've continued to see a rotation towards traditional grocery and e-commerce.
We obviously saw this period of extreme stock up. Do you think consumers have, kind of worked through that product that was purchased? Are they still holding on to that? How has that changed what they're purchasing now?
That is a $64,000 question. If everybody knew that, how much of it was consumption versus pantry stocking? I think what you're seeing is those 2 weeks, for example, ending on the 15th and 22nd of March were the pantry stocking weeks. You know, the grocery channels we track were up over 50%. Sorry, the total MULO channels we track. I gotta be careful of what we release. We're up 50% during that period, and then it has settled nicely in the mid-teens. And so, we're doing a lot of custom consumer survey work, because that's the $64,000 question, which is, what of that is been used, and then recession's impact, and then the migration out of cities potentially, and the geographic footprint. But in the end, I'd say, I think our data would show that people mostly bought, call it 2 purchase cycles worth of stuff in that first 2 weeks. So if the average purchase cycle for laundry is, 6 weeks, it's now 12, something like that. There was a doubling up of a lot of the kind of home care and categories like that.
So if we think about I guess there's 2 questions. Number one, typically, the data would suggest about half, I should say roughly half of consumption was done in food outside the home, half was done in the home. For a while, 100% of that, or let's call it 98%, some people are still doing takeout and delivery and whatnot. But as we've seen, the consumer change, right, for an extended period, right, 21 days to make a habit, what do you think are the longer term implications, number one? And number two, in those states and cities that have opened up, what are some of the changes that you've seen?
Yeah, we've, so first I think the long term, you think about the 50-50, right? Both are retail. It was like last year or 2 years ago that out-of-home sales passed, grocery store-related sales. But, and we were interesting, we got a question from a big retailer about how much of that to expect to cycle back, and because there's a lot of margin built into the actual selling of, food at a restaurant. So I think it was something like 25 or 30% would be the food cost associated with that revenue. So you would expect if all consumption moved it from out of home to in home, somewhere between 25 and 30% increase in grocery sales. We're seeing some return back to normal volumes, call it 10, 15% above all over the world, where we're tracking each market. But it's going to take a while before we settle, if ever, settle back to what it was like in, first 2 months of the year for the last 10 years. There I think are many more forces ultimately leaning you back towards an increase in consumption at home, right? You've got a recession, you have social distancing, you have restaurants that will go bankrupt and won't be there. So, it's the $64,000 question, but I would say like in a best case scenario, you've got 50 to 60%, of the restaurant activity you had 4 months ago, for a year from now.
Okay. So if we think about past recessions and how the consumer behaves, what have we seen so far, and what do you think we'll see in the future?
Historically, consumers, you see 2 sets of, or 3 sets of trends in the 08 recession. So you'll see private label does better. So for this, the portion of the population that struggles, they move away to private label. Really strong brands do fine, like high market share brands do fine. And then call it treats and snacks and impulse, and because the definition of treating yourself is no longer going out to a restaurant, it's splurging on some very tasteful ice cream or something. So those have historically been the three trends. And also migration to dollar channels. So there's a channel shift that goes on, lower cost channels, but that's not as significant. We'll see. I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty out in this world. I don't think we've actually seen that material migration, that we've seen in others. I think the purchase of private label, some of which was just availability. I do think you're going to start to see it, now, but it hasn't really shown up yet in terms of the, there is a kick up in private label, but prices are going up. And so I think you're at the beginning of this phenomena. I'm just looking at our, inflation tracker, and which we've got out on our web now, and it's showing 6-7% price inflation for the last 5 weeks, just across MULO plus convenience, which is high, and that has to do with the cost of running the stores and out of stocks and promotions being pulled back. And so I don't think you've seen the beginning of the true behavior changes, as people were just basically trying to, get necessities in a lot of parts of the country.
We spoke to several retailers who talked about the challenges around assortment optimization and demand forecasting as well. So not only, because they want to make sure that if a consumer comes into the store that they're in stock, or same thing if they're ordering online, that they're able to kind of fulfill the purchase that was made. How do you see, do you think that retailers will carry more narrow assortments? How do you think about, kind of what they do in terms of placing orders for the future? How do you think all of that kind of plays out just as we look at 2020?
Yeah, look, I think we're seeing a whole bunch of interesting things going on. The first is we are generally seeing assortment reductions from the big retailers in order to basically, fulfill demand. I think they got very clear line of sight, as one person said. It's pretty obvious to tell, what we should take out of the assortment is the items that are left on the shelf after the last 5 days, because they're ones that didn't sell. And so, and in fact, I think one of the big challenges for the manufacturers is, we call it, retail relevancy, is, how do you retain relevancy when, retailers share mind on the nuances of all the things that manufacturers often talked about: innovation, pricing, price pack architecture, variations in assortment by store. I think are going to very quickly migrate to simplified assortments, ability to deliver product in this environment where demand's going to probably stay up 10 or 15%, and then a huge opportunity for retaining new buyers and not losing loyal buyers. The data, there's been call it at least an 8x increase in the velocity and variation in what consumers have bought in the last 3 months. And so, I talk to my teams a lot, and I won't give you the example, but, up until the end of last year, if you take 2 competing manufacturers, one would grow at 2% and one would grow at 3%, and market share would shift, 10, 20 basis points. We're seeing those same 2 manufacturers, one's growing at 33 and one's growing at 16. And so that variation, you could be growing at 16%, Deb, and be losing share and still not be doing so well. And what's driving that is a lot more factors than existed, a year ago, right? You got production capacity issues, you got supply chain complexities, you got major shifts in consumer demand and preferences. City urban migrations are going on, and then you got the recession coming, and personal safety. So what we're seeing and talking to a lot of clients about, and our retail partners, is you've had immense trial, and a lot of your loyal consumers, your whole consumer profile is shifted. Instead of 2%, it's 20. And so there's going to be a lot of real winners and losers around our environment, like it's never happened before in the last 100 years.
What have been the biggest surprises you've seen in terms of category shifts and, outside of what people would expect, what are people purchasing more or less of that's surprising to you?
Let's see. Well, one of the trends that has been surprising is that people are baking bread. So there is a bit, yeast is difficult to find, and flour became difficult to find. I think the complexity of our protein supply chain, I'm not sure everybody was prepared for the complexity of the supply chain around protein. So you've seen a lot of spikes. Alcohol seems to be doing just fine. So that's, I guess, not unexpected, but up high 20s, low 30s, 10 and a half weeks in a row. So it's very stable. Traditional beauty is a category you can imagine. All the ones that you know about, like Clorox and home care and health, and have all spiked. And those, I think, will continue. And then comfort foods. We've seen a big, and initially we all thought it was just like a phenomenon, a short-term phenomenon. So when my wife came home with Kraft mac and cheese and Campbell's soup, and I was like, where'd you get those? It's like, I just got them. And those are 2 clients of ours. And so it turns out she wasn't the only one. So those traditional brands of our youth continue to hold pretty strongly in this environment as we move into, I'm not sure there's anything close to steady state, but I think people's purchasing patterns might be settling in. We're not seeing as much velocity that's driven by demand, but more by supply. There's still a lot of out of stocks out there. There's still a lot of categories.
What are you seeing in terms of high margin categories that are performing well?
We tend not to look as carefully at margin. So I would say, we tend to look at sales. Bev-Al, from what I gather, is a reasonably high margin category. We've not seen, as best that I can tell, a big shift down to private label in those categories. I think ready-to-eat meals are doing pretty well. It also varies, widely around the country. And then all those traditional, call it shelf-stable products, have continued to do well.
And then do you, from what you can understand, how much is loyalty driving, loyalty programs driving consumers to choose where they shop? Or is it where there is product in stock? Like, what is ultimately driving them to choose, whether it's online or offline, where they're consuming right now?
I think the initial rush was, where did I think I can get anything? So that was like the March phenomenon. And there was the out of stock frenzy of and then what happened for the last couple months has really been if I'm going to go out to a grocery store, I'm going to go to one. And so you're seeing fewer trips and a lot larger baskets, and therefore kind of an explosion of new members and new consumers visiting the stores that they have relationships with. I've not seen, although I have to admit I haven't looked at the data, there's definitely an explosion of new loyalty card holders and new members at all the big groceries and clubs. And then you've got the phenomenon with Amazon, that it just is growing significantly.
As you look, Andrew, I know that from the IRI CPG Supply Index, what can we learn in this environment in terms of the data that's being supplied?
You know, there's an immense amount of regional variation in in-stock availability that I just think boggles my mind. I mean, it's just, you just go to our map. If I shared the screen, you go to iriworldwide.com, you just look at pizza crust. And I'm just staring at it. The west side of the country has a, call it 25 to 40% out of stock rate, and the right side of the country is in the 8 to 12. So one of my big messages to our manufacturing clients are, you have a where your product is issue as long as you have enough production capacity. So there's like the hierarchy of, there's a number of manufacturers that ran out of capacity, right? They weren't designed for 20%, they basically built to, plus or minus 5%. And that's the other reason you're seeing assortment shrink. But I've been surprised by the wide variation of out of stocks by even at the category level. And so the conversations at first, we had a lot of questions around daily data, daily out of stocks. So that's how we took some of our out of stock models and we applied it to our daily data. And we launched them as a product. And they got a lot of demand. But then as I think the subtlety got clear that there were, some brands and categories that were like, pick the obvious one, Clorox, that is just out of stock. And so the inventory variation is just a matter of where there happens to be inventory. But the other 80%, you're just seeing a lot of volatility in demand, a lot of volatility in supply, and a lot of, effectively lost sales, missed sales opportunities. If you're not on the shelf, you don't get purchased. And then that leads to the next phenomena, which is this, explosion of new buyers and loyalists that have tried competing products. Like at levels, one CEO said, he said, there's no amount of advertising I could have done to get as many new triers as I got in the last 6 weeks. I couldn't spend enough money. And so now I think the conversation between retailers and manufacturers should be, how do we all work together to retain those, consumers? And, help figure out what the right assortments need to be going forward. So it isn't just, as much as I appreciate the comment that whatever's left, we just don't carry anymore. I think it's, consumer behavior is going to just be all over. I mean, this is the most volatile time for this industry in 100 years. There's just so many factors coming online at the same time.
So Andrew, in light of the fact it's the most, for retail and for CPG, it's probably the most challenging time we've seen in our lifetime. When, the C-suite's calling you, what advice are you giving?
You got to move faster. The days of operating the business on a 2-year cycle, you're now down to a 1 month, 2-week cycle. You've got to, so demand forecasting is a great example. Like if you're out of capacity, you're talking about a demand forecast to decide whether you're going to spend, $250 million on a production line. If you're not out of capacity, you ought to be looking at it like on a weekly basis, like a weekly rolling 12-week forecast. Because there's so much variation geographically, there's so much variation in terms of price pack sizes that are going to be in demand based on COVID cases. I mean, that you should be reforecasting your demand every, weekly on a, 13-week rolling basis. And using a whole bunch of new data sets and a whole bunch of new models, right? You weren't exactly using, the regulations associated with stay at home as a factor in your demand model. Or, each category will behave differently based on the recession and the unemployment rates in different markets. So the demand forecasting is extremely complicated. And then the consumer opportunity is now. My message has been the window is closing. We've been talking to our clients for 7 weeks about this. You have unprecedented new buyers. You have unprecedented number of people who liked your brand, pick any, water, I don't know, whatever, the Simple Truth versus natural sparkling, and those purchase cycles are, 4 to 8 weeks, and ad prices are down materially because there's nobody else advertising. So what better time if you're in our industry to spend some of the excess rents that you just materialized on your sales to basically, build your consumer franchise. This is a once in a century opportunity for these organizations to become customer centric, consumer centric.
An interesting. So what metrics should, kind of retailers and suppliers pay attention to now that they maybe haven't in the past?
I think this is an industry that's used every measure ever invented. So we have 2,000 measures in our platform. So I don't know that I'll invent one, except I will have one that I think becomes a little more important. But in the end, you got to really stay close to the consumer demand by market because it's going to shift a lot. And then call it the rebuy rate of your new consumers. So if I'm a brand and I had 5 million people try, Mark Klaus was on Kramer, so I can use this. He said through 3/29, he had 5.4 million new buyers. So one of the KPIs for the organization is probably going to be a second buy, an average spend of those new consumers, over the next, this year. Because that is an opportunity, unprecedented opportunities for Campbell's to kind of recreate their relationships with 5 million consumers. It was actually more, because that was just through March 29th. So there is a conversion measure. There is if you're a club, there's a member renewal rate that you've got to monitor because you've got a lot of new members. If you're a grocer, it's effectively basket size and trips, and you got to watch that really closely because that could go the other way. Now I've stocked my pantry, all of a sudden I feel safer to go into a small format store if I'm just getting one thing because I only got to walk, 20 feet. And then there's, my favorite unused measure, which is the lifetime value measure. So I sometimes wonder why we think all our children or all of us wake up January 1st every year as though we're going to start our purchase behavior from scratch. So there is an immense, partnership opportunity, and by definition, being an Wall Street guy, an arbitrage opportunity, because the industry doesn't really look at the value of a consumer the way a credit card company. And so if it's never looked at, then it creates arbitrage. There have to be a portfolio of consumers that if you make them loyal, will stay loyal for multiple years at the same price as a consumer who you just get a second purchase out of. There has to be.
An interesting, yeah, that's an interesting point, and obviously a huge opportunity now to not only keep customers who discovered you during this time, but also those customers who've been loyal to you over time, if they've maybe discovered new retail, to help them remember why they've enjoyed shopping you so much. So seems like there's an opportunity for marketing.
Well, and I think you've got the Amazon phenomena, which is talk about a company that's gotten a lot of trial. And as consumers have shopped more, I think, the traditional retailers value proposition, which is a click and collect, one-stop shopping, versus an Amazon, I can get an instantaneous purchase, right? There's a opportunity for call it the traditional retailers to meet the value proposition with a click and collect service. I really think that, and one that, provides all sorts of value to consumers, than having to rip up all the boxes that you have from the Amazons.
Yeah. No, I want to jump into our poll results, which I got a sneak peek, are really interesting. So I'll review those with you, Andrew. So number one, when purchasing grocery items, are you purchasing more or less private label products? 68% said whatever's in stock, no preference. 18% more private label and 14% less private label. How does that compare to what you would have expected?
It's interesting. What I would say is I think the data we have show a little bit higher migration to private label, although my guess is our audience may not represent America. The whatever's in stock is interesting because I think the level of out of stock has mitigated a bit. And so it's interesting that the population still, half of the people here are still in like, I'll take whatever I can get and get out, even though the stores have done so much to make them safer. And it feels like people are, like we were in a bunch of grocery stores this weekend, and it didn't have the same sense of urgency on in and out, like, I want to be there for 17 minutes or 16 seconds. So that's an interesting view of like whatever's in stock. Especially I think but it's also back to like our maps that are online. There's an amazing regional variation of in stock. It's unbelievable. I just look at the charts and I just think, so everybody's probably could be having a different experience. Except flour is out of stock everywhere. No, it's on the coast. There's plenty of flour in the Midland. And then the other question, too, kind of validates this point that, those are very high numbers of online shopping for grocery, 30%. I think share was like 4 or 5% coming into this situation, right, Deb?
Yeah, I think it was the official number for year-end 2019 was 2.6%. The retailers we've spoken to who are larger retailers have seen about 15% penetration. Their assumption has been that they'll keep about half of that, but I don't think, and I think it's continuing to grow. So I don't know if it's going from 15 to 10 right now versus 15 to 20, right? As consumers have gotten comfortable, the quality's good, on-time delivery, and to me, the greatest change in the industry right now will be the move to online and whatever that, kind of brings with it.
Yeah, no, I think it will think about it. Shopping was an experience to a lot of people. Yeah. It's like the Saturday thing you did with your family. And I feel like it's going to take 3 or 4 years before, like, even if there was a mysterious, a magical virus at the end of the year, I still think it's going to take a couple years before it reverts back to a destination experience. I think it's just the halo effect of this pandemic will always make people uncomfortable. Or not always. Will make people uncomfortable going to stores for another, call it, same period thereafter. And so if you're, if you're a major player with a big click and collect capability, those are the consumers I think you want to understand. One, to make sure that you can create loyalty with them, but then service them really well, because there's been such a spike in demand that the service has also been, kind of choppy. And so you'll have some consumers who did not have the call it click and collect experience they were hoping for.
Yeah, and there's, also too, right there, there's drive-through, there's buy online, pick up in the store, there's curbside, there's pickup. there's so many new, like I love it, 2 years of, kind of basically innovation, right, in 2 weeks. I mean, we've seen significant changes, but I think the consumer is continuing to communicate not only with the retailers, which is just more transparent, but in terms of what they want and how they want it. So I think that, what you talked about, which is this idea of variability in terms of in-stocks, explains a lot of the behavior that we're seeing right now. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And then this idea of kind of, have you been purchasing more packaged food over fresh products in terms of the poll? Yes, trying to stock up on packaged foods, 18%. Depends on what I need for the week, which goes back to what you said in terms of, this extreme stock up period seems to have abated. But it's 47%, and trying to eat fresh foods, 35%. How does that kind of compare to what you would have thought?
Oh, I'm just looking for something, facts and data. That's interesting. I would have said, and the quick analysis of a couple fresh food companies on my database says that it's true. That in the 4-week period, the major stock up period, I think it was mostly, heavily skewed towards shelf stable products. And so people really wanted to, the run on toilet paper and all those kinds of things that we're very familiar with. But the actual grocery purchases were things that you could feel like would be there for a while because you didn't know. There was a chance that could be your last trip to the grocery store. And I think we're seeing in the last 6 weeks kind of a more return to normal, call it balance between fresh and packaged goods. So it looks like it makes sense. That's what I would have expected to see. Well, with different time periods, right? Like fresh was probably, down a lot in March, and then it picked back up to normal in April and May.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to turn over. We have a lot of questions from the audience and limited time with our unique start. So let me just dive right in, and we'll kind of do a lightning round here, Andrew. So We'll kick it off. Can you talk about the food supply chain and potential for disruption going forward?
I think there's more risk in the supply chain than we think. It hasn't materialized as much, but in the month of April, the number of conversations I had with major players in the food industry suggested that the supply chains were reasonably complex, and I kept getting comments, you shouldn't underestimate how stable our food supply is. Now that hasn't played out quite as much, I think, as I was being told a month ago. So I think we're doing okay, but I think that it was more than just protein and meat and poultry. It was also, and the plants. It was also the import-export restrictions on a lot of raw materials. That's what one global head purchasing said to me. He said there's a lot of supply chain in the food business, and there was a lot of withholding, but we haven't seen it in the increase in out of stock. So I guess there's some there, but they're not getting worse.
Great. And then how well are multi-channel CPGs doing in shifting food service products and production capacity to the retail channel?
I think the issue is, I think different firms are doing different. I can't say I have a lot of expertise on the actual pace of migration, but it is, the players that were big in food service are the ones that are struggling the most from a top side when you look at their earnings. So there isn't enough migration to make up for the lost sales, so to speak.
Okay. Andrew, we have typically seen in the past the onset of a recession began with price deflation. However, something unique to the retail CPG sector in our current situation is that there are price increases in many categories. How should marketers be viewing price optimization and investment in promotions going into the anticipated recessionary environment? Would love to get your point of view on this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're going to see like a bifurcation of package types and a lot more, call it splintering of the demand than in a traditional recession. So I think we believe that you're going to see the movement to value segments. And so, once you wash out the extra costs of the supply chains, which is probably what's driving some of the current inflation plus the elimination of promotions, I think it's going to look like an unusual, probably wider variation geographic, deep recession, which then leads you to value priced items. And then the kind of a small number of kind of high value items for this. I mean, we're seeing bifurcation in the segments, basically.
Okay. And then this is a good one. With dynamic consumer demand, what approaches can retailers take to enhance consumer-centric collaboration with their suppliers and manufacturers?
I'm just trying to find the question. There we go. Oh, I think this is one of my favorite topics. I wish we could all do better at it. Look, I think you go back to the theme, and we've written dozens of notes and done dozens of analyses for our CPG clients, but you pick any brand, natural spring water, this is a Kroger product. There's been an immense amount of trial, both at Kroger and in water, for example, and the way that the retailers and manufacturers can partner is by actually aligning their investments to the consumer shoppers that are most important to both of them. It amazes me how little systematic ability there is to do that. So, if you're a CPG, and I say, like, I'll use Campbell's as an example, 5.4 million new triers in the month of March. To go capture those consumers, a part of it is through digital targeted and advertising, through things like, we have 500 million shopper carts. That covers about 45% of the US spend, but only half the type of spend. The other half is then work with the retailers to basically help them retain their high value consumers and help you find yours. And we just think that's such a big opportunity for retailers and manufacturers to work together. I mean, there are a number, especially in this environment where there's so much movement of consumer buying. We're advising retailers that you should have a high value list as part of our retail data program, so that it's very easy for the suppliers to know which suppliers matter to you, consumers, and then you should build in new loss retained reports and basically direct activation. So we're seeing it on 3 tiers for the CPGs. It's kind of, how big is the opportunity? How much is in media? How much is in retailer programs? And how much is you have to go find through other kind of lookalike models, like at a Walmart, where you don't have consumer data.
All right, I'm going to close it out with one last question. There's many left, but we'll look forward to speaking to you another time, Andrew. So is this crisis an opportunity for private label to thrive and earn higher market share And will there be new retail formats that also thrive during this time?
Yeah, I mean, private label traditionally does better in this environment, and it's definitely showing up in the data. And private label themselves are improving in quality. So, but you've also seen this comes back to this point about an explosion of consumers who went back to brands of their history and who've liked it. And so it's not call it an unmanaged outcome. I actually think you've seen a lot of brand loyalty in this environment, as well as a lot of private label. Private label's grown a little bit more in some categories, but in general, there's plenty of opportunity for a brand manufacturer because they've just been handed a big pool of new consumers. And what was the second half of the question, Deb? Is it because
I think that we'll see new formats thrive.
My gut intuition tells me if you take out, if you don't include, online, Walmart.com, Amazon, Target as a new format, I think it's going to be a while before you see new, call it retailer formats. But that's just my, so much money was put towards the open experience, and this, there's a vaccine, it's social distancing. I mean, now you got to spread the stores out. Now you got to keep them clean. Now you got to keep them safe. It just seems like, at least for the next 2 years, this isn't the environment that you're going to see as much creativity on store format, right? It's, it's about store safety, not store format. But you'll see a lot of innovation in terms of, I think, delivery models, and I think aggregators and new aggregators and different versions of Instacarts, and how do you meet consumer needs, and a lot more trial on pickup, and all around the safetiness of the experience. And you saw, Amazon made a big announcement about, a COVID-free supply chain, which I think was a business opportunity from a couple articles I've read since.
Well, I think I'll leave you with this thought.
I don't know what you think. I mean, the destination grocer, right? How much was spent in the last 2 years under the auspices that people wanted to hang out and have an experience at their grocer, like a restaurant. So how much of that do you think is going to be going to be on the list? To the extent that you have space, I think maybe there'll be some interesting, call it suburban destination shopping experiences where you can, they're talking about, closing down streets of Chicago to put restaurants in the middle of the streets to encourage social distancing. So maybe, the grocery experience of the future might be drive out of the city to someplace there's more space. There's also amazing increases in the number of people looking at small towns. So who knows how, back to the complexity of managing these organizations. What did Zillow said? They saw a 240% spike in people searching for houses in towns with less than 10,000 people. So who knows?
I'll tell you, two interesting things we've heard have been that their CPGs are increasingly interested in doing pop-ups, but maybe that's a way to, cheap marketing. And then secondly, what we've heard from a lot of landlords is that, especially some of the changes we believe, I think all of us have seen are starting to happen at the malls with the anchors, that maybe grocery will go into the anchors. And since, once again, you could do curbside very easily. But those are the two trends that we've heard discussed as of late. And it'll be interesting to see how those evolve throughout 2020.
Well, CPGs are thinking about going to direct to consumer and setting up their own websites. I always wonder where eBay sits in all this, given that they have all their consumers and they just seems like a natural storefront waiting for vision to arrive. Hopefully there's no one on eBay on this, but I'm just having just got my 20-year-old daughter some posters. She's into rock and roll, our generation. So I sent her some Zeppelin posters and a first edition Tom Sawyer from Rush. So I was on eBay. It made me think there's got to be a mechanism for them in terms of like, you know, a different shopping experience. I think a lot of it will come up in terms of kind of the ordering side of the house, right? As, you know, unless you were all going to default that there's only one company, I think there's got to be some interesting aggregators to make, you know, to make it a more of an experience. But, you know, that may be post-recession.
Definitely. All right. Well, with that, Andrew, thank you so much for your time and for working through our technical difficulties together. And with the amount of questions still there, we on again soon.
Look, thank you for the time. Thanks to all your listeners. I would say we'll be having lunch at some point in the near future, but it may be like some sort of virtual lunch. Yeah.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Park your car out in front of my house. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, Andrew.